1 month after the crash, the ship was ready for the trip back to the States. Work crews had removed the starboard screw and had it lashed to the fantail. The trip would be made on the port engine only. On 20 April, supplies and fuel were loaded and preparations were made to get underway. On Saturday morning, 21 April, Halsey Powell departed Ulithi for Pearl Harbor, arriving 10 days later on 01 May. Overnight, she was fueled, and she departed for Los Angeles the next day. 6 days later, she pulled into San Pedro Harbor on 08 May. The crew spent the morning offloading fuel and ammunition onto barges. Just past noon on 13 May, the ship was moved into Drydock number 3. The repair yard was ready for them, as they had a brand new stern resting atop the dock. By the end of the day, the ship was sitting high and dry on keel blocks, where she would spend the remainder of May 1945. Much of the crew got 30 days of leave, giving them time to go home and visit loved ones. June came and went, and DD-686 was still undergoing repair. When July arrived, work was nearing completion. On 03 July, DD-686 was again afloat with a brand new stern, a brand new paint job, and some new equipment. The forward torpedo tubes were gone. In their place were 2 new 40mm gun mounts. E Division fired her boilers, and the ship eased out of the Navy Yard and proceeded out to sea, where she would spend the night. At 2200 that evening, the bridge rang up and a head flank bell. The ship surged forward, cutting through the water at close to 36 knots. Just after 2300, the crew conducted a structural firing test. The gun crews were ordered to load. The firing keys were pulled, and a deafening roar erupted as 5 large fireballs belched from the muzzles of each of the 5-inch guns. The mounts were fired several times from different positions. The crew had no doubt their ship would survive. They continued another 2 hours at flank speed, running the boilers, turbines, and reduction gears at maximum capacity. After midnight, a head standard bell was rung up, and the ship slowed to a more efficient 15 knots for the remainder of the night. On Wednesday morning, the crew dropped depth charges, test-fired the 20mm guns, then headed to port. By 0900, she was tied up at the deperming dock, Pier 92, in San Pedro. Halsey Powell spent the rest of the day in the Navy Yard. It was the 4th of July, 1945. Over the 5th, 6th, and 7th of July, more tests and checks were conducted. The shipyard was officially done with the Halsey Powell on Sunday, 8 July. DD-686 sailed independently down to San Diego, pulling in just before 1500 that afternoon. July 9 through 17 was spent on the ship's second Shakedown cruise, bringing the ship's crew back up to speed with drills, training, and exercises. On Wednesday, 18 July 1945, Halsey Powell sailed northwest up California's coast toward Los Angeles. By midnight on 19 July, the crew could see the lights of Los Angeles off the starboard bow. Captain Merrill gave the order to set course for Hawaii. At 16 minutes past midnight, the helmsman rolled the tiller left and steadied up on course 260 degrees ahead standard. The trip would take 6 days, which was used to train the crew. At 0630 on the morning of 24 July, radar began painting the island of Oahu. By 1430, engines were secured and the ship was moored starboard side to the USS Sumner in Pearl Harbor. The next 2 weeks, the crew sailed near the Hawaiian Islands, drilling and training. On Sunday, 05 August 1945, Halsey Powell was fueling from a barge that was tied up alongside that morning. Nobody on board had any idea that 3,200 miles west on the island of Tinian, a place DD-686 was quite familiar with, as a year before she helped bombard Japanese positions there. A B-29 called Enola Gay had taken off. It was making its way toward the islands of Japan. It was 08:15 in the morning in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. In Pearl Harbor, it was 13:45 in the afternoon. The crew of the Halsey Powell were going about their routine duties when the Enola Gay dropped a single bomb, then made a sharp turn. 44 seconds later, an atomic bomb called Little Boy detonated in a brilliant flash of light and heat 1,900 feet above Hiroshima. 3 days later, on Wednesday, 8 August, Halsey Powell, the USS Strickland, and the USS Sea Raven were returning to Pearl Harbor after a day of training. As they entered the mouth of the harbor at 16:32 that afternoon, a second atomic bomb detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. On the morning of 10 August 1945, Halsey Powell was heading back into the conflict. She made her way out of Pearl Harbor, met up with the USS Kimberly, the Yarnell, and the Franks, all Fletchers, to form Task Unit 12.5.9. The four vessels sailed for Eniwetok. Everyone sensed the war was coming to an end. The second atomic bomb had rocked Japan the previous day. Emperor Hirohito had addressed the Japanese people on the radio, announcing that Japan would accept the terms of surrender, ending hostilities. The group arrived in Eniwetok midday on 17 August. On 21 August, she joined Task Unit 30.3.9, centered on the USS Intrepid, and the group sailed for Japan. There must have been a sense of relief among the crew, knowing that they would be sailing into now friendly waters. However, they would keep up their guard just in case this was another trick designed to lure them into a trap. Sunday, August 26, 1945, started normal enough. That was until a gunshot rang out aboard the Halsey Powell. Steward's mate, Leo Jemison, was found standing outside the radar room, a smoking Colt 45 in his hand. Commander Merrill rushed out of his stateroom and relieved Jemison of the weapon. Lying dead at the foot of the stairs leading down to officers' country was Lindsay Cannon, another steward's mate, lying in a pool of blood, eyes wide open. Jemison was placed under guard for the remainder of the voyage to Japan. The ship's doctor performed an autopsy in the wardroom and filed his findings with 3rd Fleet Command. Cannon was buried at sea the following day as the ship approached Tokyo. Jemison was eventually transferred up to Comfleet Activities to face a general court-martial for his actions. Before sunrise on Monday, 27 August, radar began to paint landfall on the PPI. Distance 59 miles, bearing 275 degrees. It was the Japanese island of Makurajima, 85 miles south of Tokyo Harbor. The crew almost certainly was on high alert as they continued deeper into territory that just days ago was so fiercely defended by the Japanese. That morning, the group was closer to Japan than ever before. General quarters was sounded at 12:13 as a precaution, and the crew went to battle stations. Halsey Powell was among the lead ships that approached the Sagami anchorage just outside Tokyo Harbor. The radar operators and soundmen were glued to their equipment, certain that any second an attack was about to be unleashed. At 17:01, Halsey Powell dropped anchor in Sagami, just a few miles offshore from Japan. As Tuesday, 28 August, dawned, no explosions, air attacks, or gunfire had occurred overnight. There were no burning ships or airplanes anywhere to be seen. Maybe the war really was over. Halsey Powell remained at anchor until 1623, when orders came to begin patrolling. She spent the next 2 days screening the armada of American warships that continued to arrive and assemble in Sagami 1. Finally, on Friday, 31 August 1945, the Halsey Powell sailed into the very belly of the beast. She entered Tokyo Harbor for the first time. By 1300, she was anchored. It must have been a bit surreal for the crew. Everywhere they looked, they were surrounded by Japan, the country they had fought so hard for the last 2 years. On Sunday, 02 September 1945, the Japanese signed the formal surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri, within sight of the USS Halsey Powell. On 05 September, liberty was permitted in Tokyo. Crew members went ashore and found destruction everywhere. They sometimes heard explosions as sappers blew up underground tunnels. DD-686 remained in Tokyo Bay for the rest of September and most of October. There was ample time for shore leave, allowing the crew to tour areas in and around Tokyo. While their sea bags grew full of souvenirs, their hearts and minds longed for home, friends, and family. Finally, on 31 October 1945, orders came instructing Desron 53 to return to Pearl Harbor. They arrived there on 09 November. 4 days later, on 13 November, they headed for the U.S. mainland, sailing up Puget Sound for Bremerton, Washington on 20 November. Various pleasure craft came out to see the sleek gray destroyer as she sailed up the smooth waters of the Sound. After a quick wave, most sped past, as if to show the crew how much faster their little powerboats were than DD-686. It seemed the teenage boy that slept deep inside Captain Merrill, that indeed sleeps inside every adult male, woke up. Word was passed down to the boys on the throttle board to get ready. The skipper gave the order, all ahead flank. The handles on the telegraph were pushed full forward. The ship surged ahead, and before they knew it, they were making 42 miles an hour. Try as they may, none of the power boats that were tagging along could match Halsey Powell's speed. One by one, they fell behind and gave up the chase. And at least for that day, DD-686 was the fastest boat on Puget Sound. Halsey Powell would remain in Bremerton until mid-January 1946, allowing many of the crew to go home on leave. The ship sailed from Bremerton to San Diego on 15 January, pulling in 3 days later. With the war over, the U.S. was rapidly reducing its naval fleet. The Halsey Powell served on America's west coast for the next 10 months. She was decommissioned in San Diego on 10 December 1946 and placed in the Pacific Reserve Fleet. This formally ended her World War II era of service. The ship would be brought back into service in 1951 to serve the U.S. Navy during the Korean conflict, and later as a training vessel. In April 1968, the U.S. Navy transferred the Halsey Powell to the South Korean Navy, which redesignated her as ROKS Seoul, DD-912. She served the South Koreans until 1982. After 39 years of service and duty, she arrived at the end of her life. Her time had run out, and she met her fate with the scrapper. Today, she lives on only in the memories of the sailors and the officers that served aboard her. The sailors and officers that served aboard DD-686 during World War II averaged 20 years in age. Their service aboard the ship was likely the biggest adventure of their lives. They were all young, energetic, with most of their lives squarely in front of them. Now the war was over, and the need for a huge naval force America had worked so hard to build had suddenly evaporated into thin air. One by one, the enlistment obligations were met. What would they do next? A few remained in the U.S. Navy and made it a career. Most had felt they had done their duty and wanted to return to civilian life. They parted ways with the Navy and went out into the world. Each took a different path, paved their own way. They married, raised families, and pursued careers. Months became years. These 20-year-old boys became 40-year-old men, more concerned with families and careers, and far less about what they did way back when they were in the Navy. Few talked much about their time aboard ship. Maybe they thought nobody cared. Maybe nobody thought to ask. Or maybe it was simply their families and careers kept them focused on the present, leaving little time to reminisce about those days. The years became decades. The crew of the Halsey Powell had somehow become old. I think the more contemplative years of retirement provide time to reflect back on one's life. 70 years of life gives one some perspective, a sort of framework to take stock of what you have or have not accomplished. Whether it was because they began to realize that their service aboard that ship really was an important part of their lives, or it was simply they liked the idea of reliving a time when they were young, spry, and healthy men. A reunion was organized, and members of the old Halsey Powell crew came together once again. I was privileged to go to one such reunion, the son of one of the veterans. I met some of these once young men that my father served with. I got to hear the stories and recollections directly from the men that lived the experience. It was my honor. Time has now stolen nearly all of these people from us. The few that remain are in their 90s, and time will soon take them as well as it will take all of us one day. Indeed, it is hard to imagine Granddad as a young man. None of us knew him then, but he was. He was a man full of life, full of energy, a man who felt so strongly about his country, his very way of life, that he put his life on the line to protect and defend it. And that is something we should never forget. I hope you enjoyed hearing the story of the USS Halsey Powell, DD-686, and her trials and tribulations during World War II. As much as I've enjoyed putting this together and learning about the sailors and their ship, this is my way of honoring my father. In fact, honoring all the men that served aboard this Greyhound of the sea, preserving the memory of the ship and her crew. Remember, life is a journey. Enjoy the ride, and I thank you so much for watching.